In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a poet's pen has fallen silent, stabbed through the heart in a locked attic. A broken wineglass, a half-burned letter, a window scratched from the outside who silenced Lawrence Vane. Was it his muse, hiding tears behind her theatrics? His publisher, driven by greed? The critic, stung by vicious verse? Or his brother, weighed down by envy? Miss Jane Marple, with her knitting needles and razor-sharp mind, unravels a web of secrets where truth cuts deeper than a dagger. In this village of whispers, the killer's name waits to be revealed. Chapter 1. The attics. Silence. The village of St. Mary Mead lay bathed in the soft glow of a July afternoon. Its cottages nestled among gardens where bees droned lazily over lavender and roses. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle, and the distant chime of the church clock marked the languid passage of time. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, a ripple of unease had begun to spread, for a tragedy had struck at the edge of the village, in the ivy-clad cottage of Lawrence Vane, the poet whose verses had stirred both hearts and tempers. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room, her fingers deftly working a pair of knitting needles, the soft click-clack a counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. Her chair, positioned by the window, offered a view of the high street, where villagers went about their business, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. It was Lily, her young maid, who brought the news, bursting into the room with the breathless excitement of youth. "Oh, miss, it's dreadful. Mr. Vane, the poet, he's been found dead-stabbed, they say, right in his attic." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild blue eyes sharpening behind her spectacles. "Stabbed, Lily," she said, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Who found him, and when?" "Mrs. Price, his charwoman," Miss Lily replied, her cheeks flushed. "She went up this morning to clean, and there he was, sprawled on the floor, a dagger in his chest. The police are there now, and the whole village is talking." Lily's voice dropped to a whisper, as if the walls might overhear. "They say it's murder, miss. Who'd do such a thing to a poet?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Lawrence Vane, though a recluse, was no stranger to controversy. His poetry, with its lyrical beauty and razor-sharp wit, had won him admirers and enemies in equal measure. His verses, often published in slim volumes that found their way to London's literary circles, could charm with their elegance or cut with their satire. Miss Marple had read his latest collection, Thorns of Verse, and noted its veiled barbs at certain figures, critic perhaps, or a rival. She wondered now if those barbs had drawn blood. "Fetch my hat, Lily," Miss Marple said, rising with the sprightliness that belied her years. "I think I shall take a walk to Mr. Vane's cottage. The air will do me good, and one never knows what one might observe." The path to Vane's cottage wound past the vicarage and the village green, where children played under the watchful eyes of their mothers. Miss Marple nodded to Mrs. Bantry, who was pruning her roses, and exchanged a word with the postman, who confirmed the villagers' buzz about the murder. The cottage itself stood apart, its stone walls half hidden by ivy, its garden overgrown, with wildflowers that seemed to mourn their master's passing. A small crowd had gathered near the gate, whispering and craning their necks, but a stern-faced constable kept them at bay. Inspector Critic, a man whose competence was tempered by a certain impatience with village ways, met Miss Marple at the door. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat with a wry smile, "I might have known you'd turn up. Care to take a look, since you're here? But mind, it's a grim business. The attic was reached by a narrow staircase, its steps creaking underfoot. The room itself was a low, slanted space, its beams dark with age, its single window admitting a shaft of dusty light. Lawrence Vane lay on the floor, his slight frame crumpled beside a worn oak desk. His dark hair was dishevelled, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, and a dagger, its handle carved with intricate vines, protruded from his chest. Blood had pooled on the floorboards, staining a scattering of papers, one of which bore the inked lines of an unfinished sonnet. The air held the faint tang of ink and wine, and Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a broken wine-glass near the body, its fragments glinting in the light. "Found this morning, as Lily told you, Craddock," said, his notebook in hand. No sign of forced entry, and the window was locked from the inside. The daggers clean no prints. Whoever did this knew what they were about. Miss Marple stepped carefully round the room, her eyes taking in every detail. The desk cluttered with quills and manuscripts, a candle burned low in its holder, a half-burned letter in the grate. She bent to examine the letter, its edges charred but a few words visible. Truth must out. The phrase struck her, echoing a line from Vane's. Poetry, she straightened, her mind already weaving connections, though she said nothing to Craddock. Instead, she asked, who was close to him, Inspector? A man like Vane must have had his share of visitors. Craddock sighed, flipping a page in his notebook. For we know of all in the village last night. Clara Beaumont, his musa theatrical, sought, always trailing after him. Edgar Holt, his publisher, who was pushing for a new book. Rupert Giles, a critic who loathed Vane's work and wasn't shy about saying so. And Thomas Vane, his brother, who's been seen lurking about, though they were on bad terms. Each had reason to be here, and each has a story to tell. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her thoughts racing. She knew the ways of villagers, where secrets hid behind polite smiles and grudges simmered beneath the surface. Lawrence Vane's death was no random act. It was a knot of motives and passions, waiting to be unravelled. As she descended the stairs, leaving the attic's silence behind, she resolved to listen closely to St. Mary Mead's whispers. The truth, she knew, was there, hidden in the folds of human nature, as familiar to her as the stitches of her knitting. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime, the village of St. Mary Mead, though stirred by the tragedy of Lawrence Vane's murder, retained its outward calm, as if the summer sun could bleach away the stain of violence. The poet's cottage, however, stood apart, its ivy-clad walls, now a silent witness to the grim event within. Miss Jane Marple, having returned from her initial glimpse of the scene, felt the weight of the mystery settle upon her like a familiar shawl. She knew that murder, like a poorly knitted scarf, revealed its flaws only upon close inspection, and she was determined to examine every thread. Inspector Craddock, a man whose brisk efficiency was tempered by a grudging respect for Miss Marple's insights, had sent word that he would welcome her presence at the cottage for a more thorough examination. "You've a knack for seeing what others miss," he had said, his tone half admiring, half exasperated. Miss Marple, with her basket of knitting and her unassuming air, arrived at the cottage just as the church clock struck 11. The constable at the gate, a young man named Harris, nodded her through with a deferential "Morning, Miss Marple," his eyes betraying the awe that village gossip had woven around her. The narrow staircase to the attic creaked under her careful steps, each groan of the wood a reminder of the cottage's age and secrets. The attic itself was a low, shadowed space, its slanted ceiling pressing down like a lid on a box of mysteries. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper, ink, and a faint metallic temps that Miss Marple recognized as the residue of blood. Lawrence Vane's body had been removed, taken to the coroner's for examination, but the scene remained untouched, preserved for the police's scrutiny. Inspector Craddock stood by the desk, his notebook open, his brow furrowed as he surveyed the room. "Here we are, Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to the space. "A puzzle, if ever there was one. No fingerprints, no forced entry, and a locked window that hasn't been opened in years, by the look of it. Yet someone got in, stabbed Vane, and got out again without leaving a trace." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in the room with a quiet intensity. The oak desk, worn smooth by years of use, was cluttered with the tools of a poet's trade: a quill pen, its tip stained with ink; a bottle of indigo, tipped over but not spilled; a stack of manuscripts, some neatly tied with ribbon, others scattered as if caught in a sudden gust; a single candle, burned down too. A stub stood in a brass holder, its wax dripped onto a sheet of paper bearing a half-finished sonnet. The words, in Vane's elegant hand, spoke of betrayal and hidden truths, and Miss Marple made a mental note to revisit them later. Her gaze moved to the floor, where a dark stain marked the spot where Vane had fallen. The dagger, now bagged and labelled by Craddock's men, had been an ornate thing, its handle carved with vines and flowers, a curious weapon for a murder, she thought, more suited to a collector's case than a killer's hand. Near the stain lay the fragments of a broken wine glass, its delicate stem snapped clean. The glass intrigued her. Its shards suggested a sudden movement, perhaps a struggle, but the rest of the room showed no signs of chaos. The manuscripts were disordered, yes, but not torn or trampled, and the desk's contents were disturbed, but not overturned. "Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, her voice soft as she bent to examine the glass. A glass broken, but no bottle to be found. Did the killer take it, or was it never here? Craddock frowned, flipping through his notes. The muse, Clara Beaumont, mentioned bringing a bottle of wine last night, said she, and Vane shared a glass before she left. "We're checking for traces of poison, though the stab wound seems the cause of death." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Clara, whose theatrical grief had struck her as a performance. She moved to the fireplace, where a half-burned letter lay in the grate, its edges blackened but a few words still legible. Truth must out. The paper was thick, the kind used for formal correspondence, and the handwriting was Vane's own, precise and flowing. She wondered if the letter had been meant for someone specific or if it was a draft of one of his poems, its destruction an act of fear or rage. "The letter," she said, pointing to the grate. "Have you had it examined, Inspector?" Craddock nodded. "We've sent it to the lab, but it's too charred to make out much. Seems to be in Vane's hand, though might be a clue or just another of his scribbles." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. She knew the value of a poet's scribbles, especially one like Vane, whose words could wound as sharply as any blade. She turned her attention to the window, a small, diamond-paned affair set high in the wall. Its latch was rusted, and a layer of dust suggested it hadn't been opened in months, if not years. Yet, as she peered closer, she noticed a faint scratch on the sill, barely visible in the dim light. It was a thin, precise mark, as if a tool had been wedged there, perhaps to pry the latch from outside. "Inspector," she said, beckoning him over, "this scratch. It's fresh, isn't it? not weathered like the rest of the sill. Critic squinted at the mark, his expression skeptical. Could be nothing, Miss Marple. A bird, a branch, or just wear and tear. Perhaps, she replied, her tone mild, but her mind alert. But a locked window is a curious thing in a murder case, don't you think? It suggests either great cunning or great familiarity with this room. Craddock grunted, making a note to have the window tested. He then outlined the suspects, his voice brisk as he ticked them off. Clara Beaumont, the muse, was here last night, by her own admission. Says she left around 9, after a row about. His latest work, Edgar Holt, the publisher, came by earlier, pushing Vane to sign a new contract. Rupert Giles, the critic, admits to a confrontation around 8 claims Vane's latest poem slandered him. And Thomas Vane, the brother, was seen near the cottage around 10, though he swears he was at the pub. None have airtight alibis, and all had reason to want Vane silenced. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her mind was far from idle. She knew that motives, like village gossip, often hid the truth beneath layers of exaggeration. Clara Beaumont, with her dramatic airs, might have loved Vane or hated him more both. Edgar Holt, whose polished exterior belied a calculating nature, stood to gain or lose from Vane's work. Rupert Giles, whose reviews dripped with venom, had been publicly humiliated by Vane's satire. And Thomas Vane, burdened by debt and resentment, might have seen his brother's death as a path to freedom. Each was a thread in the tapestry of the crime, but which had been pulled to unravel Vane's life. She stepped back to the desk, her eyes lingering on the sonnet. The lines, though incomplete, were vivid, in shadows deep, where secrets lie, the heart betrays with silent cry. Miss Marple wondered if Vane had sensed his own end, his pen capturing a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. She noted the absence of a wine bottle, the oddity of the broken glass, and the letter's cryptic phrase. These were not random details, but pieces of a puzzle, each shaped by the killer's hand. As she and Craddock descended the stairs, the inspector paused. "You're quiet, Miss Marple," he said, his tone probing. "What's on your mind?"
"Oh,
"Nothing definite, Inspector," she replied, her smile disarming. "But I find that a room, like a person, has its own way of speaking. This attic has told us something, if we listen closely." Craddock raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, accustomed to her cryptic remarks. Outside, the village hummed with its usual rhythm, but Miss Marple felt the undercurrent of unease. She thought of her own garden, where weeds could choke a flower, if left unchecked, and saw the murder in much the same way, a dark growth that needed rooting out. As she walked back to her cottage, her basket swinging lightly at her side, she resolved to speak with each suspect, to test their stories against the silent testimony of the attic dot back in her drawing room. She took up her knitting, the needles, resuming their steady rhythm. Lily, bringing in a tray of tea, chatted about the village's theories. Some blamed Clara's jealousy, others Holt's greed, a few whispered of Giles's wounded pride, and many pointed to Thomas's desperation. Miss Marple listened, her face serene, but her mind was already sorting through the tangle of motives and opportunities. She knew that murder, like a poem, followed a pattern, and she would find it, stitch by stitch, until the truth lay bare. Afternoon sun slanted through her window, casting long shadows across the room. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts returning to the attic's silence. The scratched sill, the broken glass, the burned letterall were clues, but they were also distractions, like the flourishes of a poet's pen. The real answer, she suspected, lay not in what was present, but in what was missing. The wine bottle, the motive behind the letter, the reason for the locked window. As she set her cup down, she felt a familiar stirring, the quiet thrill of a mystery unfolding. Lawrence Vane's death was a story half told, and Miss Marple was determined to write its ending. Chapter 3. The Muses lament. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of gold and amber, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Rose Cottage, the home of Clara Beaumont. The air was warm, carrying the faint hum of bees and the chatter of sparrows, but Miss Marple's thoughts were far from the pastoral calm. The murder of Lawrence Vane, stabbed in his attic, had stirred the village like a stone dropped into a still pond, and Clara, his self-proclaimed muse, was a ripple that demanded closer inspection. Miss Marple's neat figure, clad in a sensible tweed skirt and carrying her ever-present knitting basket, moved with a purpose that belied her unassuming demeanour. Rose Cottage was a picture of charm, its walls draped in climbing roses, whose petals fluttered to the ground like soft pink confetti. The front door, painted a cheerful blue, stood ajar, and from within came the sound of a gramophone playing a mournful aria. Miss Marple knocked lightly, and Clara herself appeared, her auburn hair loose about her shoulders, her eyes rimmed with red as if from recent tears. She wore a flowing silk dress, more suited to a London stage than a village parlour, and her movements had the studied grace of an actress aware of her audience. Miss Marple, Clara said, her voice tremulous, "How kind of you to call. I'm quite undone by Lawrence's death." She gestured toward a plush armchair in her parlour, where laced curtains filtered the sunlight into soft patterns. "Please, sit. Would you care for tea?" Miss Marple accepted, settling into the chair with a polite smile, her knitting basket at her feet. The parlour was a study in contrasts. Delicate china teacups sat beside a cluttered table strewn with poetry books, a half-finished embroidery, and a vase of wilting lilies. The gramophone's aria swelled, and Clara dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, its edges frayed as if from frequent use. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Miss Beaumont," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but her eyes keen. "You were close to Mr. Vane, I understand. His muse, they say." Clara's lips trembled, and she pressed the handkerchief to her cheek. "Oh, Miss Marple, he was my soul's fire. His words, they were like music, and I was privileged to inspire them. We spent hours together, weaving dreams into verse." Her voice broke, and she turned her face toward the window, as if seeking solace in the fading light. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she drew a skein of wool from her basket. She had seen grief before, in all its forms raw, quiet. Feigned, and Clara's struck her as a performance, polished yet lacking depth. "You visited him the night he died, I believe," she said, her voice as mild as the summer breeze. "Inspector Craddock mentioned a bottle of wine you brought to celebrate his latest work." Clara's eyes flickered, but she recovered quickly, her hand fluttering to her throat. "Yes, we toasted his new collection. Thorns of Verse, such a brilliant title, don't you think? But we quarrelled, I'm afraid. Nothing serious, just a difference of opinion about a sonnets meter. I left him at 9, quite alive, scribbling away in that attic of his." She sighed, her gaze distant. "I never imagined it would be the last time I'd see him." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind noting the careful phrasing. "A quarrel over a sonnet," she mused. "Poets can be passionate about their craft. Was it a heated exchange? Oh no, Clara said, a touch too quickly. Just a lively discussion. Lawrence could be stubborn, but I adored his fire. She leaned forward, her eyes wide with earnestness. You must understand, Miss Marple, I loved him, not as a lover, perhaps, but as an artist loves her inspiration. His death is a wound to my heart. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression sympathetic, but her thoughts elsewhere. She recalled the broken wine glass in the attic, its shards scattered near Vane's body. Clara's story of a shared toast was plausible, yet the absence of a bottle nagged at her. Had it been removed, and if so, why? She glanced at the table, where a small silver tray held a decanter of sherry and 2 glasses, their stems intact. You brought the wine yourself, you said. A special vintage, perhaps. Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting the handkerchief. Just a bottle from the village shop, nothing grand. Lawrence wasn't one for extravagance. She rose, moving to the gramophone to change the record, her movements graceful but deliberate, as if to steer the conversation elsewhere. Would you like to hear one of his poems? I have a copy of his latest work. Miss Marple declined with a polite smile, her eyes lingering on Clara's hands. They were delicate, the nails manicured, but a faint tremor betrayed her composure. Perhaps another time, she said. Tell me, Miss Beaumont, did Mr. Vane seem troubled that evening? Any hint of fear or unease? Clara returned to her seat, her expression thoughtful. He was ... distracted, perhaps. He mentioned a letter he was writing, something about setting things right. I didn't press him, he could be secretive about his work. She paused, then added, he did say something odd, though. The truth cuts deeper than a knife, he said. I thought it was just his poetic way, but now ... Her voice trailed off, and she dabbed at her eyes again. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning over Clara's words. The phrase echoed the half-burned letter in the attic. Truth must out, and she wondered if Vane had been alluding to a specific truth, one dangerous enough to provoke murder. Clara's grief, though artfully displayed, seemed to conceal something of fear, perhaps, or a secret she dared not voice. Miss Marple thought of her niece, Mabel, whose theatrical friend had once wept copiously over a lost role, only to later admit it was a ploy for sympathy. People, she knew, could perform their emotions as skillfully as any actor. As they sipped their tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to lighter matters, asking about Clara's life in St. Mary Mead. Clara spoke of her love for the arts, her brief stint on the London stage, and her decision to settle in the village for its quiet beauty. Yet her answers were vague, her anecdotes polished as if rehearsed. Miss Marple noted the absence of personal mementos in the parlour, no photographs, no letters, only the trappings of a carefully curated image. It was as if Clara Beaumont were a character in her own play, her true self hidden behind the footlights. The visit drew to a close, and Miss Marple rose, thanking Clara for her hospitality. As she stepped into the garden, the roses brushing against her skirt, she glanced back to see Clara standing at the window, her silhouette framed by the lace curtains. The aria had begun again, its mournful notes drifting into the evening air, and Miss Marple felt a pang of certainty that Clara's tears were not for Vane alone. There was something more, something unspoken, in the muse's lament. Walking back to her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the encounter. Clara's story held together, yet it was too smooth, like a poem with perfect rhyme but no soul. The missing wine bottle, the broken glass, the cryptic words about truth, all pointed to a scene staged with care, perhaps to conceal a deeper motive. She thought of the village postmistress who had mentioned Clara's frequent late-night visits to Vane's cottage, and the grocer's tale of her purchasing wine only days before. These were small threads, but Miss Marple knew that even the smallest could unravel a mystery when pulled with care. Back in her drawing-room, she took up her knitting, the familiar click of the needles soothing her thoughts. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the village settled into the quiet of dusk. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from quiet. She saw Clara's trembling hands, her calculated gestures, and the shadow of something unspoken in her eyes. The muse had played her part well, but Miss Marple had seen such performances before in the quiet dramas of village life. The truth, she suspected, lay not in Clara's tears, but in the silences between them, and she would listen closely until those silences spoke. Chapter 4. The publisher's prophet. The morning mist clung to the lanes of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the villages, cottages, and lending an air of mystery to the familiar. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting basket tucked under her arm, walked briskly toward the village inn, where she had arranged to meet Edgar Holt, Lawrence Vane's publisher. The inn, a sturdy building with a thatched roof and a sign depicting a cheerful ploughman, was a hub of village life, its taproom alive with the low hum of conversation. Miss Marple, however, sought the quieter upstairs parlour, where Holt had agreed to speak with her over a pot of tea. Edgar Holt was waiting when she arrived, seated at a polished oak table with a view of the high street. He was a man in his late 40s, with a lean face and a meticulously trimmed moustache that seemed to compensate for his thinning hair. His suit, though well-tailored, bore the faint sheen of frequent wear, and his cufflinks gold, embossed with a quillcot, the light as he rose to greet her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as a salesman's, "a pleasure, though the circumstances are grim. I trust you're here to shed light on poor Vane's demise." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her smile polite but her eyes alert. "I hope to understand Mr. Vane better, Mr. Holt," she said, setting her basket beside her. "You knew him well as his publisher. Perhaps you can tell me about the man behind the poetry." Holt leaned back, his fingers tapping the table in a restless rhythm. "Lawrence was a talent, no question," he said. "His verses had he chose to use it. But he was stubborn, Miss Marple, maddeningly so, always chasing his muse instead of the market." He shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Poetry doesn't pay, not unless you're Byron, and even then, it's a gamble." The inns maid, a girl with a shy smile, brought a tray of tea and scones, and Miss Marple poured, her movements precise. She noted Holt's polished manner, the way his eyes darted to the door as if expecting interruption. "You visited him the night he died, I believe," she said, passing him a cup. "To discuss a new contract," Inspector Craddock said. Holt's smile tightened, and he sipped his tea before answering. "Yes, I was there around 7. Lawrence was in one of his moods, half genius, half mule. I'd proposed a new collection, something more accessible to sell to the London crowd. He laughed in my face, said he'd rather starve than write doggerel." He set his cup down with a clink. "We argued, I won't deny it, but I left him alive, scribbling his nonsense in that attic." Miss Marple's needles emerged from her basket, their soft clicking a counterpoint to the inn's distant clamour. She thought of the attic, with its scattered manuscripts, and the half-burned letter bearing the words "truth must out." Holt's talk of a new contract suggested financial strain, and she recalled the grocer's gossip about Holt's recent purchase of an ornate dagger, supposedly a gift for a client. Publishing must be a challenging business, she said, her tone conversational. Mr. Vane's work, though brilliant, didn't bring much profit, I gather. Holt's jaw twitched, but his voice remained even. Poetry is a labor of love. Miss Marple Lawrence's last book, Thorns of Verse, sold modestly enough to keep him in ink and candles, but not much more. I'd invested heavily in him, you see. Advances, printing costs, distribution. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He owed me, in a manner of speaking, and he knew it. That's why I pressed for the new contract. Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. She thought of her nephew Raymond, whose friend in the publishing world had once spoken of the delicate balance between art and commerce. Holt's cufflinks, ostentatious for a man claiming financial policy, financial strain, suggested a man living beyond his means, and she wondered if his frustration with Vane had boiled over into something darker. You must have been disappointed, she said, to lose such a promising author. Disappointed. Holt's laugh was sharp, like a snapped twig. I was furious, but not enough to kill him. Lawrence was difficult, but he was my ticket to respectability in literary circles. His death is a loss, professionally and personally. He reached for a scone, breaking it apart with unnecessary force. I've no reason to wish him harm, Miss Marple. Quite the opposite. She observed the slight tremor in his hand, the way his eyes avoided hers when he spoke of Vane's value. The inn's parlour was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth. But there was a chill in Holt's words, a calculated edge that set her mind working. She recalled the attic's orderly chaos, the manuscripts, the broken wine glass, the absence of a bottle. Holt's visit had preceded Clara Beaumont's, and she wondered if he had seen something in the attic, perhaps the letter Vane was writing. That threatened his interests. Mr. Vane was working on something new. I understand, she said, her voice as soft as the steam rising from her teacup. Something that might have stirred controversy. Did he mention it to you? Holt's fingers paused on his scone, crumbs falling to the table. He was always working on something, he said, his tone dismissive. Lawrence loved his grand gestures, poems about truth and betrayal, that sort of thing. I didn't pay much mind. My concern was getting him to write something that would sell. He brushed the crumbs from his hands, his cufflinks glinting again. If he was stirring trouble, it wasn't with me. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her thoughts. Weaving a pattern, Holt's denial was smooth, but she sensed a crack in his composure, like a flaw in a fine porcelain cup. She thought of the Village's Whispers Holt's recent trip to London, his meetings with creditors, his purchase of the dagger now lying in evidence. The dagger, she mused, was an odd choice for a gift, its carved handle too specific for a casual purchase. Had it been meant for Vane, not as a gift but as a tool for silence? As the conversation turned to lighter topics, the weather, the inn's excellent scones, Miss Marple steered it back subtly, asking about Vane's relationships. He was a solitary man, by all accounts, she said, but he had his circle. Miss Beaumont, for instance, and his brother, Thomas. Holt's expression soured. Clara was a leech, feeding off his talent for her own glory. As for Thomas, he was a parasite, always begging for handouts. Lawrence had his burdens, Miss Marple, but he was too soft-hearted to cut them loose. He drained his tea, his movements brisk. If you're looking for enemies, start there. I had no quarrel with him beyond business. Miss Marple smiled, thanking him for his time as she gathered her basket. The inn's parlour felt suddenly close, the fire too warm, and she stepped into the cool mist of the afternoon with relief. As she walked back to her cottage, the village waking to the day's routines, she turned Holt's words over in her mind. His polished exterior hid a man under pressure, his profits tied to a poet who refused to bend. The dagger, the missing wine bottle, the burned letter all pointed to a motive rooted in more than a failed contract. She thought of her neighbor, Mrs. Price, whose husband had once gambled away their savings, driven by desperation to preserve appearances. Holt, with his gold cufflinks and tight smile, struck her as a man clinging to a facade. Back in her drawing room, Miss Marple took up her knitting, the needle's rhythm a steady counterpoint to her thoughts. The fire glowed softly, and outside, the mist began to lift, revealing the village's familiar contours. Holt's story was plausible, but it was too neat, like a manuscript edited to hide its flaws. The truth, she knew, lay in the gaps between his words, his gestures, and the silent evidence of the attic. As she looped the wool, she saw the pattern of the murder taking shape, and Edgar Holt's place in it was far from clear. Chapter 5. The critic's venom. The afternoon light filtered through the leaded windows of the St. Mary Mead library, casting a lattice of shadows across the worn oak tables. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting basket tucked beneath her arm, stepped into the quiet sanctuary, where the air smelled of aged paper and polished wood. She had come to speak with Rupert Giles, the critic whose scathing reviews of Lawrence Vane's poetry had fueled a public feud that now hung over the poet's murder like a storm cloud. The library, with its rows of leather-bound volumes and hushed atmosphere, seemed an apt setting for a man who wielded words as weapons. Rupert Giles was seated in a corner, a volume of Keats open before him, his lean frame hunched as if guarding the book from intrusion. His face, angular and marked by a perpetual sneer, bore the look of a man who found the world wanting. His eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles, flicked up as Miss Marple approached, and he closed the book with a snap that echoed in the stillness. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped and cool, "I suppose you're here about Vane. The village is abuzz with his demise, and I'm no doubt cast as the villain." He gestured to a chair opposite him, his movements precise, almost mechanical. "Sit, if you must. I've nothing to hide." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her smile disarming as she drew her knitting from the basket. "I'm merely seeking to understand Mr. Vane, Mr. Giles," she said, her needles beginning their soft, rhythmic dance. "You knew his work well, perhaps better than most. Your reviews were forthright, shall we say." Giles's sneer deepened, and he leaned back, crossing his arms. "Forthright. I called a spade a spade." Miss Marple Vane's poetry was a patchwork of clichés and borrowed brilliance. His rhymes were trite, his metaphors derivative. He fancied himself a modern Shelley, but he was a hack in a garret, scribbling for an audience that didn't exist. His voice carried a venom that seemed to linger in the air, and Miss Marple noted the tightness of his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the table. She nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. His latest work, Thorns of Verse, seemed to stir particular ire, she said, her tone conversational. "I believe you called it a blight on the literary landscape. Strong words, Mr. Giles." "They were deserved," he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "Vane had the gall to mock me in that collection, a poem, thinly veiled, accusing me of bias, of selling my opinions to the highest bidder. Slander, Miss Marple, pure and simple. I went to his cottage that night to demand an apology, to tell him he'd gone too far." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment, as she met his gaze. "You saw him the night he died, then," she said, her voice soft as the library's hush. "Around 8, was it? What happened during your visit?" Giles shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming a restless tattoo on the table. "I found him in that wretched attic, scribbling as usual. I told him his poem was libelous, that it would ruin my reputation if published. He laughed, and said the truth would out, whatever the cost. We argued, voices raised, but I left him alive." Miss Marple hunched over his desk with his precious quill. His sneer returned, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, a crack in his polished disdain. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts turning to the attic, the scattered manuscripts. The half-burned letter with its cryptic truth must out. Giles's account aligned with Vane's own words, yet the critic's anger felt too raw, too personal, to be mere professional rivalry. She recalled the village's literary society, where Giles had once denounced Vane's work in a tirade that left the room silent. Pride, she knew, could be a dangerous thing, and Giles's was as sharp as the dagger that had ended Vane's life. "You must have felt deeply wronged," she said, her tone sympathetic. "To be mocked in verse, especially by one whose work you found wanting, it would sting any man's pride." Giles's lips thinned, and he adjusted his spectacles with a precise motion. "Pride? I've no need for pride, Miss Marple. I deal in facts, in standards. Vane's work was a mockery of those standards, and his attack on me was a cheap ploy for attention. I told him as much, and I left. That's the end of it." He opened his book again, as if to dismiss her, but his fingers trembled slightly. Betraying his composure, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving connections. She thought of her friend Miss Hartnell, whose sharp tongue had once sparked a village quarrel over a misjudged remark. Giles's venom, though cloaked in intellectual disdain, had a similar edge, one that could cut deeply when provoked. The dagger, with its ornate handle, came to mind had it been Giles's, perhaps rather than Holt's gift. The grocer's tale of Holt's purchase was village talk, not fact, and Miss Marple knew how gossip could twist the truth. "Did Mr. Vane mention a letter he was writing?" she asked, her voice as gentle as the sunlight filtering through the window. "Something about setting things right, perhaps?" Giles's eyes flicked up, sharp and wary. "A letter? No, he said nothing of it. He was too busy spouting nonsense about truth and art. If he was writing something, it was likely more of his drivel." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Look to his muse, Miss Marple, or that wastrel brother of his. They had more reason to want him dead than I did." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her thoughts racing. Giles's deflection was swift, but it lacked conviction, like a poorly crafted line in a poem. She recalled the scratched windowsill in the attic, the faint mark that suggested a clever exit. Giles, with his precise mind and knowledge of Vane's habits, might have known the attic's quirks, how to manipulate a latch, how to stage a locked room. The letter, with its damning phrase, could have been Vane's final jab at the critic, a truth too dangerous to publish. As the conversation drifted to the library's collection, spoke with relish of Keats, and Coleridge, Miss Marple steered it gently back. "Mr. Vane's satire must have been galling," she said, "especially if it threatened your standing. A critic's reputation is his currency, after all." Giles's sneer returned, but it was brittle now, like glass on the verge of cracking. "My reputation is built on honesty, Miss Marple, not flattery. Vane's accusations were baseless, and I'd have proved it in court if need be. His death is an inconvenience, nothing Marive reviews to write, deadlines to meet. He stood, tucking the book under his arm. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Miss Marple rose, thanking him for his time with her usual courtesy. As she left the library, the village, coming alive with the clatter of a passing cart and the laughter of children, she turned Giles's words over in her mind. His venom was palpable, his pride a wound that festered. She thought of the broken wine glass, the missing bottle, the burned letter, all pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a motive rooted in fear of exposure. Giles's claim of leaving Vane alive rang hollow, like a line that didn't scan. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, the fire casting a warm glow across the room. Her knitting resumed, the needle's steady rhythm a mirror to her thoughts. Giles's anger, his trembling hands, his swift dismissal of the letter, they were stitches in a pattern, one that suggested a man desperate to protect his name. She recalled the villagers' whispers of Giles's tirades, his obsession with Vane's work, and saw in him a man whose intellect masked a deeper vulnerability. The truth, she suspected, lay in the critic's venom, and she would probe its source until it yielded its secrets. Chapter 6. The Brothers' Burden. The evening draped St. Mary Mead in a soft twilight. The sky a tapestry of deepening blues and purples as the last light faded behind the church spire. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting basket slung over her arm, made her way to the churchyard, where she had learned Thomas Vane, the poet's estranged brother, could be found. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp grass and the faint smoke of a distant bonfire, and the village seemed to hush itself, as if holding its breath in the wake of Lawrence Vane's murder. The churchyard was a quiet place, its ancient yews casting long shadows over weathered gravestones. Thomas Vane stood alone near the family plot, a solitary figure in a worn coat, the glow of his cigarette a small beacon in the dusk. His face, lined and shadowed, bore a resemblance to his brother's. But where Lawrence's features had been softened by dreams, Thomas's were hardened by resentment. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his eyes narrowing, but he made no move to leave. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice rough, like gravel underfoot, "come to poke about in my sorrows, have you? The village already has me pegged as the black sheep." He took a drag on his cigarette, the smoke curling upward like a wisp of defiance. Miss Marple stopped a respectful distance away, her expression gentle but her gaze steady. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Vane," she said, setting her basket on a nearby bench. "Losing a brother must be a heavy burden, whatever the circumstances." Thomas gave a bitter laugh, flicking ash onto the grass. "Burden. Lawrence was the burden, Miss Marple, always lording his words over me, his poetry, his so-called genius. He had the family's favour, their money, their pride left me with. Nothing but debts and a name I couldn't escape." He gestured toward the graves, where their parents' names were etched in stone. "They're gone, and still he outshone me, even in death." Miss Marple's hands found her knitting, the needles emerging with their familiar, soothing click. She thought of the attic, with its blood-stained floor and scattered manuscripts, and the half-burned letter that whispered of truth. Thomas's bitterness was palpable, a wound that festered in the shadow of his brother's fame, and she wondered if it had driven him to a desperate act. "You saw him the night he died, I understand," she said, her voice as soft as the evening breeze. "Near the cottage, around 10. Thomas's eyes flicked to her, sharp and wary. "So the village Gossips say I was at the pub, Miss Marple, drowning my troubles in ale. Ask the barmaid, she'll tell you I was there till closing. He stubbed out his cigarette on a gravestone, his movements abrupt. I won't lie, went by his cottage after. Wanted to ask for a loan, just enough to clear my slate. But the door was locked, the lights dim. I didn't go in. Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. She recalled the barmaid's vague account, a memory clouded by the pub's bustle, and noted the tremor in Thomas's hands as he lit another cigarette. His alibi was thin, like threadbare cloth, and his resentment was a motive as old as Cain. She thought of her cousin's son, who had once squandered his inheritance on cards, his anger at the world a mirror to Thomas's own. You and Lawrence were not close, then, she said, but family ties run deep. Did he often refuse you help? Thomas's laugh was a harsh bark. Refuse? He'd lecture me, Miss Marple, about responsibility, about pulling myself up, as if he knew what it was to scrape by. He sat in his attic, spinning words while I ran. From creditors. That night, I hoped he'd soften, but I never got the chance to ask. He looked away, toward the darkening horizon, his voice dropping. Now he's gone, and I'm left with nothing but whispers of murder. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning to the attic's clues, the broken wine glass, the missing bottle, the scratched windowsill. Thomas's presence near the cottage placed him at the scene, and his desperation suggested a man capable of violence. Yet his story, though tinged with anger, held a note of resignation, as if he had accepted his brother's refusal long before. She wondered if his visit had been more than a plea for money, perhaps a confrontation over a deeper grievance. Did Lawrence ever speak of enemies? She asked, her tone mild. Someone who might have wished him harm. Thomas snorted, exhaling a plume of smoke. Enemies. Half the village could claim that title. His muse, Clara, with her crocodile tears, she clung to him like ivy, but I saw her temper when he ignored her. That publisher, Holt, was always sniffing around, greedy for a bestseller, and Giles, the critic of Lawrence's poems, cut him deeper than any knife. He paused, his eyes narrowing. If you're looking for a killer, Miss Marple, look to them. I just wanted his money, not his life. Miss Marple's needles resumed, her thoughts weaving a pattern. Thomas's deflection was practiced, but his bitterness was raw, a wound that bled through his words. She recalled the villagers' tales of his gambling debts, his arguments with Lawrence overheard at the pub, and saw a man trapped by his own failures. The dagger, with its ornate handle, came to mind had it been a weapon of opportunity, or something more personal. The grocer's story of Holt's purchase was uncertain, and Thomas, with his rough hands and restless energy, might have owned such a blade as the churchyard grew darker. The stars beginning to prick the sky, Miss Marple steered the conversation. To Lawrence's work, his poetry was admired, she said, but it could wound. Did he ever share his latest verses with you? Thomas shook his head, his expression sour. He stopped showing me anything years ago. Said I wouldn't understand. But I heard him muttering once, something about truth and betrayal. Sounded like more of his high-flown nonsense. He flicked his cigarette away, the ember glowing briefly. On the grass? If he wrote something dangerous, it wasn't for me to know. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the fading ember, her mind on the half-burned letter. Thomas's dismissal of his brother's words felt too casual, like a man avoiding a truth too close to home. She thought of the attic's locked window, the faint scratch that suggested a staged exit, and wondered if Thomas, familiar with the cottage from childhood, knew its secrets. His alibi, though supported by the barmaid, was shaky, and his presence near the cottage placed him in the frame. "Thank you, Mr. Vane," she said, gathering her basket. "You've been most helpful. I hope you find some peace in this difficult time." Her tone was kind, but her gaze was searching. Noting the slump of his shoulders, the weight of his burdens, Thomas gave a curt nod, turning back to the graves as she walked away. The churchyard was silent now, save for the rustle of leaves, and Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery settle upon her. Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair, the fire's glow casting shadows across the room. Her knitting resumed, the needles click a steady rhythm as she turned Thomas's words over in her mind. His anger, his desperation, his thin alibi with threads in a tangled skein. And she would tease them apart until the pattern emerged. She thought of the village's whispers, the barmaid's uncertain memory, the letter's cryptic phrase. Thomas's burden was heavy, but was it heavy enough to kill? The truth, she knew, lay in the silences between his words, his glances, and the attic's mute testimony. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple saw the murder as a poem, its lines jagged and incomplete, but she would find its rhythm, stitch by stitch, until it sang of justice. Chapter 7. The half-burned letter. The morning sun crept over St. Mary Mead, its rays piercing the mist that lingered in the hollows of the village lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy drawing-room, the fire crackling softly in the grate, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, measured rhythm. Outside, the village stirred with its usual routines. Milk bottles clinked on doorsteps, and the postman's whistle echoed faintly. But Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on the murder of Lawrence Vane, a puzzle that grew more intricate with each passing day. The half-burned letter found in the poet's attic, its surviving words, "Truth must out," had lodged in her mind like a burr, and she resolved to examine it more closely, sensing it held the key to the killer's motive. She had arranged with Inspector Critic to view the letter, now held at the police station in Much Benham, a short bus ride from St. Mary Mead. As she gathered her shawl and basket, Lily, her maid, bustled in with a tray of tea, her eyes bright with the villagers' latest gossip. "They're saying it was a crime of passion," Miss Lily said, setting the tray down. "Some think Miss Beaumont did it, others that brother of his, and Mrs. Bantry swears it's that critic, Mr. Giles, what with his nasty reviews." She paused, breathless. "What do you make of it, miss?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene but her mind alert. "I make nothing of it yet, Lily," she said, adjusting her hat. "Gossip is like a garden full of weeds until you know what to pluck. Now, mind the house while I'm gone." She stepped into the crisp morning, the bus stop, a short walk, past the vicarage, where the vicar's wife was sweeping leaves with vigorous disapproval, as if they too were suspects in the crime. The police station in Much Benham was a squat, red brick building, its interior bustling with the quiet efficiency of rural law enforcement. Inspector Critic greeted her with his usual mix of courtesy and mild exasperation, his tie slightly askew from a morning spent poring over reports. "Miss Marple," he said, leading her to a small office, "you're like a hound on a scent. Here's the letter, or what's left of it." The labs confirmed it's Vane's handwriting, but the fire took most of it. "Not much to go on, I'm afraid." He placed a sealed envelope on the table, its contents carefully preserved in a clear plastic sleeve. The letter, or what remained of it, was a single sheet of heavy paper, scorched at the edges. With only a fragment of text legible, truth must out, though daggers guard its gate. The words were written in veins, elegant, looping script, the ink a deep indigo that matched the bottle on his desk. Miss Marple peered at it through her spectacles, her fingers itching to trace the lines, though she kept them folded in her lap. Curious, isn't it? She said, her voice soft. The phrase is from his poetry, I believe. I recall a line from Thorne's, a verse something about truth and daggers. Did he mean to send this, or was it a draft of his work? Shrugged, leaning against the desk. Could be either. Vane was always scribbling, half his papers full of half-baked lines, but the fire suggests someone didn't want it read. The killer, maybe, trying to cover their tracks. He tapped the sleeve. No address, no signature, just those words. The lab found traces of ash from the grate, but nothing else. Whoever burned it was careful. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the paper, her mind turning over the suspects. Clara Beaumont, with her theatrical tears, had mentioned Vane's talk of setting things right. Edgar Holt, the publisher, had dodged questions about Vane's latest work, his focus on profit rather than poetry. Rupert Giles, the critic, had admitted to a confrontation over a slanderous poem, his pride stung by Vane's words. And Thomas Vane, the brother, had spoken of his brother's obsession with truth, though he claimed ignorance of any letter. Each had been in the cottage that night, each a thread in the tapestry of the crime. She thought of the attic, the broken wineglass, the missing bottle, the scratched windowsill. The letter's destruction suggested a motive tied to its contents, a secret Vane had meant to reveal. "Have you considered the handwriting, Inspector?" she asked, her tone mild. "It's unmistakably Mr. Vane's, but the paper is fine. Not the usual sort for a draft. Perhaps it was meant for someone specific, a warning or an accusation." Craddock raised an eyebrow, jotting a note. "You think he was writing to one of them? Clara maybe, or Giles. The lab's trying to lift more text, but the charring's too deep. We've got men checking Vane's correspondence, but he wasn't one for letters. Most of his business went through Holt." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose husband had once burned a letter from a rival, only to regret it when the truth came out another way. People burned letters to hide truths, she knew, and Vane's killer had acted with haste, leaving the fragment behind. She wondered if the letter had been meant for a literary journal, as Vane's feud with Giles suggested, or a personal missive to someone closer. Clara, perhaps, or even Thomas. "May I see the other evidence?" she asked, her voice as gentle as the morning light. Craddock obliged, leading her to a table where the dagger, now cleaned and bagged, rested beside photographs of the attic. The dagger's handle, carved with vines, was more ornate than practical, and Miss Marple recalled the grocer's tale of Holt's purchase, though Thomas's rough hands could have wielded such a blade, and Giles's precision suggested a man capable of choosing it for effect. The photographs showed the desk, the scattered manuscripts, the candle burned low, and the window's faint scratch, each detail a note in the murder's grim melody. As they discussed the scene, Craddock shared the coroner's report. Vane had died instantly, the dagger piercing his heart. No poison was found in the wineglass shards, ruling out Clara's bottle as a factor, but the absence of the bottle itself puzzled him. "It's as if the killer took it," he said. "But why? To hide something, or just to confuse us?" Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "People are rarely so tidy in their crimes, Inspector," she said. "The bottle's absence is a clue in itself, like a missing word in a poem, and the letter it's burning suggests fear, not confusion. She thought of her nephew Raymond, whose literary friends often spoke of the power of words to wound, and saw Vane's letter as a weapon, one the killer could not allow to reach its mark. Leaving the station, Miss Marple boarded the bus back to St. Mary Mead, her mind weaving the letter's words into the fabric of the case. The village greeted her with its familiar sights, the bakery's warm aroma, the children playing on the green, but her thoughts were in the attic, with its silent testimony. The letter's phrase, "Truth must out," echoed Vane's poetry, and she wondered if it was an accusation aimed at one of the suspects, or a broader truth about the village itself. Back in her cottage, she settled into her armchair, the fire's glow casting shadows across the room. Her knitting resumed, the needles click a steady rhythm as she pondered the letter's significance. Clara's dramatics, Holt's greed, Giles's wounded pride, Thomas's desperation, each could have feared Vane's truth, but only one had burned the letter and driven the dagger home. She thought of the villagers' whispers, the postmistress's tales of Clara's late-night visits, the grocer's story of Holt's dagger, the vicar's account of Giles's rants, and the barmaid's vague memory of Thomas. The truth, she knew, was in the letter's ashes, and she would sift through them until it emerged, as the fire crackled. Miss Marple saw the murder as a stanza, its lines jagged but deliberate. The half-burned letter was its heart, and she would trace its meaning, stitch by stitch, until the killer's name was revealed. Chapter 8. The Village Whispers. The late morning sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle glow, its rays glinting off the dukest cobblestones and the polished brass of shop signs. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting basket swinging lightly at her side, set out on her customary walk through the village, her senses attuned to the hum of daily life. The murder of Lawrence Vane had stirred the village like a gust through a quiet orchard, and Miss Marple knew that in the chatter of its inhabitants lay clues as vital as any found in the poet's attic. Her steps were measured, her smile polite, but her eyes were sharp, catching every glance and whisper that rippled through the lanes. She began at the post office, where Mrs. Clegg, the postmistress, presided over her counter with the air of a general surveying a battlefield. The small shop was crowded with villagers collecting letters and parcels, their voices low but eager as they traded theories about the murder. Mrs. Clegg, her spectacles perched on her nose, beckoned Miss Marple forward with a conspiratorial nod. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," she said, her voice a hushed thrill. "Mr. Vane, stabbed in his own home. I always said that Miss Beaumont was trouble, always flitting to his cottage at all hours, carrying on like a heroine in one of those novels." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of mild interest. "Miss Beaumont visited often, then?" she asked, adjusting her shawl. "Late at night, you say?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Clegg replied, leaning closer. "I've seen her myself, slipping out past 10, her cloak wrapped tight like she didn't want to be noticed. And the night he died, my Tom saw her near the cottage, carrying a bottle wine, I reckon, though she's not one for the pub." She paused, her eyes gleaming. "If you ask me, she was jealous of his talent, or maybe his heart strayed elsewhere." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. Clara Beaumont's late-night visits, confirmed by the postmistress, added weight to her story of bringing wine, but the timing past 10 clashed with her claim of leaving at 9. She thought of her friend Miss Weatherby, whose neighbour had once spun tales of scandal to deflect her own secrets, and wondered if Clara's dramatics hid a deeper motive. "Thank you, Mrs. Clegg," she said, purchasing a stamp she didn't need. "You've a keen eye, as always." Her next stop was the grocer's, where Mr. Pye, a stout man with a penchant for gossip, was stacking tins behind the counter. The shop smelled of fresh bread and spices, and a handful of customers lingered, their baskets half filled as they swapped theories. Mr. Pye greeted Miss Marple with a flourish, his apron dusted with flour. "Miss Marple, come to unravel our little mystery, have you?" he said, his voice booming. "That publisher, Mr. Holt, he's my bet, bought a fancy dagger from a peddler last week. Said it was for a client, but I'm not so sure. Too sharp for a paperweight, if you ask me." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile as she selected a packet of tea. "A dagger, Mr. Pye," she said, her tone curious but unhurried. "An unusual purchase for a publisher." "Unusual?" "Indeed," Mr. Pye said, lowering his voice as if the shelves might overhear. "It had a carved handle, all vines and such, like something out of a storybook. He was in a hurry, too, paid in cash and didn't haggle. And he was asking after Vane's habits when he was home, who visited. Seemed mighty interested for a man just talking business." He shook his head, his jowls quivering. "Mark my words, Miss Marple, there's greed behind this." She thanked him, her mind turning to Edgar Holt's polished exterior and his strained smile at the inn. The dagger's description matched the murder weapon, but village gossip, she knew, could be as slippery as wet leaves. She recalled her cousin Ethel, who had once bought a gift only to have it misjudged as a threat, and wondered if Holt's purchase was as innocent as he claimed or if it was a calculated step toward murder as she continued down the high street. Miss Marple paused at the church, where the vicar, Mr. Clement, was tending the flower beds with a distracted air. His face, usually serene, was clouded, and he greeted her with a sigh. "A sad business, Miss Marple," he said, brushing soil from his hands. "Lawrence Vane was a troubled soul, but to meet such an end. I saw Mr. Giles at our literary society last month, railing against Vane's work. Called it blasphemous, if you can believe it. He was near apoplectic, pacing the room like a caged beast." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. "Mr. Giles does have strong opinions," she said, adjusting her basket. "Did he mention anything specific about Vane's latest poems?" The vicar frowned, his trowel pausing. "He said Vane had crossed a line, mocking his integrity in verse something about a poem, accusing him of taking bribes for reviews. I tried to calm him, but he was furious, said Vane's words could ruin him. I never thought it would come to this, though." He shook his head, returning to his flowers. "Pray for us, Miss Marple. The village needs peace." She thanked him, her thoughts on Rupert Giles's venomous pride, his confrontation with Vane in the attic. The poem, likely the same one that had sparked the burned letter, was a motive as sharp as the dagger itself. She recalled her nephew, Raymond's friend, a critic who had once lashed out over a slight, his ego a fragile thing, and saw in Giles a man whose reputation was his lifeblood. Her final stop was the village pub, the Blue Boar, where the barmaid Jenny was polishing glasses behind the counter. The pub was quiet, its lunchtime crowd yet to arrive, and Jenny's freckled face brightened at Miss Marple's entrance. "Miss Marple, you're a sight," she said, setting down a cloth. "Everyone's talking about poor Mr. Vane. I saw his brother Thomas here the night it happened, drinking like there was no tomorrow, kept muttering about Lawrence, how he'd never help a soul in need." Miss Marple settled at a table near the window, her knitting emerging as Jenny brought her a cup of tea. Thomas was here late, then? She asked, her voice gentle. Until closing, I believe he said. Jenny's brow furrowed, her hands twisting the cloth. Well, he was here, sure, but I can't say for certain when he left. It was a busy night, and he was in and out, always pacing. I heard him say something about going to see his brother, but I didn't mark the time. He was 3 sheets to the wind, mind you, so it might have been nothing. She hesitated, then added, He's got debts. Miss Marple owes half the village, from what I hear. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. Thomas's shaky alibi, now further weakened, placed him near the cottage at a critical hour. She thought of her neighbour's son, who had once pawned family heirlooms to settle gambling debts, his desperation a mirror to Thomas's own. The missing wine bottle, the scratched window-sill, the burned letter all pointed to a crime of haste, perhaps driven by a brother's resentment. As she finished her tea and stepped back into the sunlight, Miss Marple felt the villagers' whispers settle around her like dust. Each snippet Clara's late-night visits, Holt's dagger, Giles's fury. Thomas's debts was a thread in the murder's fabric, but none yet formed a clear pattern. She thought of the attic, its silent clues, and saw the case as a poem, half-written, its meaning hidden in the spaces between words. Back in her cottage, she took up her armchair, the fire casting a warm glow across the room. Her knitting resumed, the needle's rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. The villagers' gossip, though tangled, had given her new threads to follow. Clara's inconsistent timing, Holt's suspicious purchase, Giles's wounded pride, Thomas's desperation. The truth, she knew, was woven into these whispers, and she would listen until they spoke clearly, revealing the hand that had struck Lawrence Vane down. Chapter 9. The locked window, the soft patter of rain greeted St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple stepped out of her cottage, her umbrella raised against the drizzle that had settled over the village. The grey sky lent a sombre air to the lanes, mirroring the shadow cast by Lawrence Vane's murder. Miss Marple, her knitting basket tucked beneath her shawl, made her way toward the poet's cottage, her mind fixed on the attic and its enigmatic locked window. The faint scratch on the sill, noticed during her earlier visit, had lingered in her thoughts, a small but insistent clue that suggested the killer's cunning. Inspector Craddock had agreed to meet her there, his curiosity piqued by her mention of the mark, and she hoped a closer look might unravel another thread of the mystery. The cottage stood forlorn under the rain, its ivy glistening wetly, its windows dark save for the glow of a police lantern within. The constable at the gate, his collar turned up against the damp, nodded her through with a respectful "Afternoon, Miss Marple." She climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, the creak of the boards a familiar echo, and found Craddock by the window, his face etched with the frustration of a case that refused to yield its secrets. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with weariness, "you've got me looking at scratches now. I hope this isn't a wild goose chase." He gestured to the small, diamond-paned window, its rusted latch gleaming dully in the lantern's light. "The lab boys say it's been locked for years, dust and grime all over it. No one could have come or gone this way without leaving a mess." Miss Marple approached the window, her eyes tracing the faint scratch on the sill, a thin, deliberate mark, no wider than a hairpin. "And yet, Inspector," she said, her voice soft as the rain outside, "this scratch is fresh, not weathered like the rest. Someone used a tool, perhaps, to work the latch from outside. A clever trick to make a murder seem impossible." Craddock frowned, bending to examine the mark. "Clever, maybe, but risky. You'd need to know the window's quirks, how to jimmy it without breaking the glass. And why bother when the door was easier? He straightened, his notebook in hand. The door was locked, mind you, but Vane could have let the killer in. No need for acrobatics. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile, her knitting emerging from her basket as she settled onto a stool near the desk. People are theatrical, Inspector, she said, her needles clicking softly. A locked room adds drama, confusion. It points us away from the truth. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose mystery novels often featured such devices, and saw the attic as a stage, its props carefully arranged to mislead. She turned her gaze to the room, its details sharpened by the grey light, the oak desk, still cluttered with manuscripts, the candle stub, its wax hardened into a frozen drip, the dark stain on the floor where Vane had fallen, the broken wine glass, its shards now bagged as evidence, lay in her memory, as did the missing bottle and the half-burned letter with its cryptic truth must out. The window, she suspected, was not just a clue but a statement, a flourish, by a killer who wanted to baffle. Test the latch, if you would, Inspector, she said, her tone mild but firm. A thin blade or wire could have lifted it, even from outside. The scratch suggests as much. Critic sighed but signalled to a constable, who produced a small toolkit. With careful precision, the young man inserted a slender probe into the gap beneath the latch, mimicking an external approach. After a moment's effort, the latch clicked, and the window swung inward with a groan, admitting a gust of damp air. Craddock's eyebrows rose, and he jotted a note. "Well, I'll be," he said. "It's possible, then. But who'd know to do that? Someone familiar with the cottage, I'd wager." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily, precisely. "Inspector, the killer knew this attic's quirks, its secrets. A stranger would not risk such a method." Her mind turned to the suspects, each of whom had crossed the cottage's threshold that night. Clara Beaumont, with her frequent visits, would know the attic's layout, though her theatrical nature seemed ill-suited to such precision. Edgar Holt, the publisher, had been there to discuss business, but his polished exterior suggested calculation, not mechanical skill. Rupert Giles, the critic, with his sharp mind, might have studied the cottage's weaknesses during his confrontation. And Thomas Vane, the brother who had grown up in the house, would know its every creak and latch dot. She recalled the village whispers gathered on her walk, Clara's late-night comings and goings, Holt's purchase of a dagger, Giles's fury at Vane's satire, Thomas's drunken rants. The window's scratch added a new layer, pointing to a killer with both opportunity and forethought. She thought of her nephew Raymond, whose friend had once rigged a window to sneak into a locked study, a prank that now seemed eerily relevant. "Have you found anything else, Inspector?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room. Traces of the tool, perhaps, or fibres caught in the frame. Craddock shook his head, his expression grim. "Nothing yet. The rain's likely washed any traces outside, and the frame's clean. But I'll have the boys look again, now we know the latch can be worked." He paced the attic, his boots scuffing the floorboards. "This changes things, Miss Marple. If the killer came through the window, it rules out a spur-of-the-moment act. This was planned." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind weaving the clues into a pattern. The locked window, the burned letter, the missing bottle all suggested a killer who acted with care, yet left traces of haste. She thought of the letter's phrase, "Truth must out," and wondered if Vane had been writing to expose a secret the killer could not bear. Giles's wounded pride, Holt's financial strain, Thomas's desperation, Clara's hidden motives, each could have feared such a truth. But only one had the knowledge to stage this scene. As the rain drummed softly on the roof, Miss Marple rose, her gaze lingering on the window. "A locked room is a challenge, Inspector," she said, "but it's also a confession. The killer wanted us to marvel, to doubt our own eyes. But truth, like rain, finds a way through the smallest cracks." She thought of the villages. Gossip, each Guiza system. The user was cut off mid-sentence, likely due to an input error or system limitation. I will assume the intent was to continue the narrative and proceed with completing the chapter in the style of Agatha Christie, maintaining the established tone, content, and avoiding repetition. The cut-off phrase appears to be leading into a reference to the village gossip or clues, so I will continue from there, focusing on the locked window and its implications, while weaving in the suspects and the broader mystery. Gossip. Each snippet a thread in the tapestry of Lawrence Vane's murder. The window's scratch, now proven to be a point of entry, shifted the case from a simple crime of passion to a calculated act, one that required intimate knowledge of the cottage's quirks. Miss Marple's mind turned to the suspect's connections, to the attic, Clara Beaumont's frequent visits, Edgar Holt's business dealings, Rupert Giles's heated confrontation, and Thomas Vane's childhood familiarity with the house. Each had the opportunity, but the window suggested a killer who planned their escape, a detail that narrowed the field yet deepened the puzzle. She stepped back from the window, her eyes lingering on the desk where Vane's final words lay scattered. The manuscripts, though disordered, were untouched by Violant's snow-torn pages, no signs of a frantic search. The killer had been precise, striking once with the dagger and burning the letter, yet leaving the attic otherwise intact. It was a controlled act, she thought, like a single, deliberate stroke of a poet's pen. The absence of the wine bottle, mentioned by Clara, was another anomaly, perhaps taken to obscure a detail of the Meetinger sedative, or simply to muddy the waters. Miss Marple recalled her cousin Gertrude, whose gardener had once staged a break-in to cover a theft, and saw a similar intent here. A scene crafted to mislead. "Inspector," she said, her voice as calm as the rain's steady rhythm, "the window's latch changes the story we're reading. It's not just a murder, but a performance, meant to make us look elsewhere, perhaps at a passing stranger, or a locked room impossibility. But the killer knew this place, knew Vane's habits. We must look closer at those who crossed this threshold that night." Critic nodded, his face thoughtful. "You're right, Miss Marple. This wasn't random. Clara, Alt, Heelis, Thomas. They all had reasons to be here, and reasons to want him silent. The letter's burning points to something specific, something Vane was about to reveal." He glanced at the desk, where the candle's wax had hardened into a frozen tear. "I've got men checking their alibis again, and will search the cottage grounds for any trace of that bottle or tool. But it's like chasing a shadow in this rain." Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet dance, her thoughts weaving through the suspect's motives. Clara's theatrical grief and late-night visits suggested a personal stake, perhaps a spurned affection or a secret she feared exposed. Holt's financial pressures, underscored by the grocer's tale of his dagger purchase, hinted at a man desperate to protect his investment. Giles's fury over Vane's satire, confirmed by the vicar, pointed to a pride wounded enough to kill, and Thomas, with his debts and bitterness, knew the cottage's every crevice, his alibi weakened by the barmaid's uncertainty. The window's scratch, she mused, was a clue to their character, a killer who planned yet acted in haste, leaving the letter's fragment behind as they descended the attic stairs. The cottage creaking around them like an old ship, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery settle anew. The rain had eased, leaving a glistening sheen on the village, and she stepped outside, her umbrella folded but her mind open to the clues. The locked window was a riddle within a riddle, a lock picked not by force but by knowledge. She thought of her friend Miss Hartnell, whose locked shed had been opened by a neighbour's clever trick, and saw the attic as a similar puzzle, its solution hidden in the familiarity of the killer's hand. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, the fire's glow casting shadows that danced like the villagers' whispers. Her knitting resumed, the needles click a steady rhythm against the patter of rain on the windows. The locked window, the burnt letter, the missing bottle, these were not mere details, but stanzas in a poem of murder, each line pointing to a truth Vane had died to reveal. She saw the suspects in her mind's eye, Clara's trembling hands, Holt's polished cufflinks, Giles's sneering pride, Thomas's smouldering resentment. The window's scratch was their signature, and Miss Marple would trace it, stitch by stitch, until the killer's name was laid bare. Chapter 10. The Critic's Motive. The soft glow of late afternoon filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's drawing room, casting delicate patterns across the polished floorboards. The rain had ceased, leaving St. Mary Mead with a fresh, clean scent, as if the village itself sought to wash away the stain of Lawrence Vane's murder. Miss Marple, her knitting basket at her side, had invited Rupert Giles, the critic, for tea, sensing that his venomous feud with the poet held a key to the attic's grim secret. Her armchair, positioned to catch the light, offered a view of the garden, where roses nodded under the weight of lingering raindrops, but her mind was fixed on the puzzle of the locked window, the half-burned letter, and the dagger's fatal thrust. Giles arrived promptly, his lean frame clad in a severe black coat, his wire-rimmed spectacles glinting like twin blades. His face, etched with its habitual sneer, softened slightly at the sight of Miss Marple's cosy parlour, though his eyes remained wary, as if expecting an ambush. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into the offered chair with a stiff nod, "I assume this isn't merely a social call. You're sniffing about Vane's death, aren't you?" "Well, I've said my piece to the police." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as gentle as the steam rising from the teapot she poured. "Oh, I'm merely an old woman with too much time on her hands, Mr. Giles," she said, passing him a cup. "But I do find Mr. Vane's poetry fascinating, and your reviews were so ... insightful. I thought you might share a little more about your disagreement with him." Her needles emerged from the basket, their soft clicking a counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. Giles's sneer twitched, and he sipped his tea, his fingers gripping the delicate handle with unnecessary force. "Disagreement is putting it mildly," he said, his voice sharp as a quill's point. Vane was a charlatan, dressing up mediocrity in pretty words. His thorns of verse was an insult to literature, and his latest poem, published, thank heavens, was a direct attack on me. He accused me of taking bribes, of selling my reviews to publishers like Holt. Slander, Miss Marple, nothing less. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "That must have been deeply wounding," she said, her tone sympathetic. "A critic's reputation is built on integrity, after all. To have it questioned in verse, especially by one so admired, would sting any man." Giles's jaw tightened. and he set his cup down with a clink. Sting, it was an outrage. I went to his cottage that night to demand he retract it. I told him I'd sue, ruin him in court if he dared publish. He mocked me to my face, said the truth would out and damn the consequences. His voice rose, a flush creeping up his neck. I left him scribbling in that attic, alive and insufferable. If you're looking for a motive, Miss Marple, look to his muse or his wastrel brother. I had no need to kill him, my pen was weapon enough. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the attic, the scratched windowsill, the broken wine glass, the half-burned letter with its echo of Vane's words, truth must out. Giles's fury was palpable, his pride a raw wound, and she recalled the vicar's account of his tirade at the literary society, his pacing like a caged animal. She thought of her friend Miss Weatherby, whose neighbour had once lashed out over a public slight, his ego a fragile shield, and saw in Giles a man whose reputation was his fortress, now under siege. You mentioned his poem, she said, her voice as soft as the fire's crackle. Was it only your reputation he targeted, or did he hint at others? Mr. Holt, perhaps, or Miss Beaumont? Giles's eyes narrowed, his fingers drumming on the armrest. He aimed at me, that's certain. If he had barbs for others, he didn't share them. Holt was his paymaster, and Clara his shadow. Neither seemed to trouble him as I did. He leaned forward, his sneer returning. Vane thought himself a truth-teller, but he was a fool, stirring hornets' nests with his doggerel. If he wrote something dangerous, it was his own doing. Miss Marple's needles paused, her thoughts on the burned letter. Its phrase, so close to Giles's own words, suggested Vane had been writing to expose the critic, perhaps to a literary journal or a rival. The window's scratch, now confirmed as a point of entry, pointed to a killer with precise knowledge, and Giles's sharp mind, honed by years of dissecting texts, could have mastered such a trick. She recalled the grossest tale of Holt's dagger, but wondered if Giles, with his meticulous nature, might have procured a similar blade to cast suspicion elsewhere. "Did you notice anything unusual in the attic that night?" she asked, offering a plate of shortbread, a letter, perhaps, or signs of another visitor. Giles took a piece, breaking it with a snap. Nothing but his usual mess paper's ink, that infernal candle. He was writing, as always, hunched over like a monk. I didn't stay long enough to snoop. His tone was dismissive, but his eyes flickered, a brief shadow of unease crossing his face. If there was a letter, I didn't see it, and I certainly didn't burn it. Miss Marple's smile remained gentle, but her mind was alert. Giles's quick denial of the letter felt rehearsed, like a line memorized for an audience. She thought of the village whispers, Clara's late-night visits, Holt's financial strain, Thomas's debts, and Giles's public feud. The critic's motive was Vane's poem threatened his livelihood, his standing in literary circles, the locked window, the burned letter. The dagger's thrust all pointed to a killer who acted with precision yet left traces of panic, as if caught off guard by Vane's defiance. As they finished their tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to lighter matters, the village's literary society, the charm of Keats's odes, but her thoughts remained on Giles's trembling hands, his flushed anger. She recalled her nephew Raymond's friend, a scholar whose pride had led to a bitter quarrel, and saw in Giles a man whose intellect masked a deeper vulnerability. His motive was as sharp as the dagger, but was it sharp enough to kill? Thanking him for his time, she showed him to the door, the afternoon light now fading into dusk. As Giles's figure receded down the lane, his coat a dark smudge against the twilight, Miss Marple returned to her armchair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The fire's glow cast shadows across the room, and she turned Giles's words over in her mind. His fury, his denial, his fleeting unease they were. Stitches in a pattern, one that aligned with the attic's clues. The letters burning, the windows scratch. The missing bottle all suggested a killer who feared exposure, and Giles's pride was a beacon in the fog of the case. She thought of the village's gossip, each whisper a thread, Clara's tears, Holt's greed, Thomas's desperation, and now Giles's wounded honour. The critic's motive was the strongest yet, but Miss Marple knew that motives, like poems, could deceive with their clarity. The truth, she suspected, lay in the silences between Giles's words, his glances, and the attic's mute testimony. As the fire crackled, she saw the murder as a stanza, its lines sharp and deliberate, and she would trace them, stitch by stitch, until the killer's name emerged from the shadows. Chapter 11. The final piece. The soft light of a July afternoon filtered through the windows of Lawrence Vane's cottage, casting a muted glow over the attic where Miss Jane Marple stood once more. The rain had long since cleared, leaving Mary Mead bathed in a gentle warmth, but the attic retained its sombre air, as if the poet's death lingered in its beams. Miss Marple, her knitting basket at her side, had returned with Inspector Craddock's permission to re-examine the scene, her mind humming with the threads of evidence gathered from the villagers' whispers and the suspect's guarded words. The half-burned letter, the scratched window-sill, and the broken wine-glass formed a pattern. But one final piece eluded her. Her piece, she sensed, lay within this cramped, shadowed space. The attic was much as she had last seen it. The oak desk, cluttered with manuscripts, the candle stub frozen in its wax, the dark stain on the floorboards marking Vane's final moments. The window, its latch now confirmed as manipulable, stood closed, but the faint scratch on the sill gleamed in her memory like a beacon. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, lingered on the broken wine-glass, its shards removed. Too evidence, but vivid in her mind. Clara Beaumont's claim of a shared toast, the missing bottle, and the letter's cryptic truth must out all pointed to a staged scene. A murder dressed in misdirection. She moved to the desk, her fingers brushing the scattered papers. The unfinished sonnet, its lines of betrayal and hidden truths, lay untouched, its ink smudged as if Vane had paused mid-thought. Miss Marple recalled Clara's theatrical tears, Edgar Holt's strained ambition, Rupert Giles's wounded pride, and Thomas Vane's smouldering resentment. Each had a motive, each had opportunity. But the window's scratch suggested a killer with intimate knowledge of the cottager killer who planned yet faltered, leaving the letter's fragment unburned. Her gaze fell on the fireplace where the half-burned letter had been found. The great cold now held traces of ash, and she pictured the killer's haste, the flames licking at Vane's words but failing to consume them entirely. The phrase truth must out, though daggers guard its gate echoed in her mind, a line from Vane's own poetry, and she wondered if it was a draft or a message meant for someone specific. The handwriting, unmistakably Vane's, suggested a personal act, but the paper's quality fine, formal hinted at a purpose beyond the poet's musings. Miss Marple stepped back, her knitting needles emerging from her basket as she sat on a stool, the click of the needles a steady rhythm against the attic's silence. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose mystery novels often hinged on a single overlooked detail, and saw the broken wine glass as such a clue. Clara had claimed to bring wine, sharing a glass with Vane before their quarrel, but the shards suggested a sudden drop, not a thrown or shattered glass. Had it fallen in a struggle, or was it placed to mislead? The missing bottle nagged at her, its absence a deliberate act, perhaps to hide a sedative or simply to obscure the killers. Presence. She recalled the villagers' whispers, Clara's late-night visits, confirmed by the postmistress, Holt's purchase of a dagger, as per the grocer, Giles's fury at Vane's satire, noted by the vicar, and Thomas's shaky alibi, weakened by the barmaid's uncertainty. The window's scratch, now proven to allow entry, pointed to a killer. Familiar with the cottage Thomas, with his childhood memories, or Giles, whose precision suggested a mind for detail. Clara's dramatics seemed less likely to involve such mechanics, and Holt's greed pointed more to opportunity than planning. As she pondered, Inspector Craddock's footsteps sounded on the stairs, his face appearing in the doorway. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of respect and impatience. "You're back again. Found anything new, or are you just communing with the ghosts?" She smiled, her needles pausing. "Ghosts speak softly, Inspector, but this attic has much to say. The wineglass, for instance, its shards, were scattered, not smashed. A drop, not a throw, and the letter burned, but not destroyed. The killer was hurried, yet careful enough to lock the window behind them." Craddock nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "We've checked the grounds, again no sign of that bottle. The lab's working on the letter, but the charring's too deep for more text. The dagger's clean, no prints, and the coroner's final report confirms a single, precise strike. Whoever did this knew what they were about." He sighed, rubbing his brow. "I'm leaning toward Giles's feud with Vane was public, and that poem hit him where it hurt. But Thomas's debts keep nagging at me, and Clara's story doesn't quite add up." Miss Marple's needles resumed, her thoughts weaving through the suspects. Clara's grief, though vivid, felt staged, her timing off by the postmistress's account. Holt's financial strain was motive enough, but his polished demeanor suggested a man who avoided violence. Thomas's desperation and familiarity with the cottage made him a strong candidate, yet his resignation hinted at a man defeated, not murderous. Giles, however, stood out his pride, stung by Vane's accusation of bribery, was a wound that bled anger. The letter, she suspected, was Vane's final blow, meant to expose Giles to a literary journal or rival critic. She rose, her eyes scanning the attic one last time. The sonnet's lines, "In shadows deep, where secrets lie," echoed the letter's phrase, and she saw Vane's death as a poet's last act writing, a truth that cost him his life. The window's scratch, the burned letter, the dropped glass all pointed to Giles, whose meticulous nature could have planned the entry, whose panic might have left the letter's fragment behind. She thought of her nephew Raymond's friend, a scholar whose obsession with reputation led to a bitter feud, and saw in Giles a man driven to silence, a threat. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but firm, the letter was Vane's weapon, aimed at Mr. Giles. Its burning was no accident, but a desperate act to hide a truth too dangerous to publish. The window's latch, the glass's fall, these are the killer's signature, and I believe they point to a mind both sharp and shaken. Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, jotting a note. "Giles, then we'll bring him in again. Press him on the letter." If he knew Vane was sending it to a journal, he'd have reason to panic. He glanced at the attic, his expression grim. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. I'll have the boys check Giles's rooms for any trace of that bottle or a tool for the latch." As they descended the stairs, the cottage creaking around them, Miss Marple felt the puzzle's pieces aligning. The attic's clues, the villagers' whispers, the suspect's guarded wordsaw formed a pattern, its lines sharp and clear. Back in her cottage, she settled into her armchair, the fire's glow casting shadows across the room. Her knitting resumed, the needles click a steady rhythm as she saw the murder as a poem, its final stanza near Giles's motive, the letters. Truth, the windows scratch, they were the final piece, and she would place it, stitch by stitch, until the killer stood revealed. Chapter 12. The truth must out the village hall of St. Mary Mead, with its polished wooden floor and rows of mismatched chairs, was an unlikely stage for the unravelling of a murder. Yet it was here that Miss Jane Marple had gathered the suspects on a quiet July evening. The hall, usually host to whist drives and flower shows, hummed with a different energy tonight, its air thick with anticipation. The windows, open to the soft summer breeze, admitted the scent of honeysuckle, but the room's occupants, Beaumont, Edgar Holt, Rupert Giles, and Thomas Vane, sat in tense silence, their faces a study in guarded unease. Inspector Critic stood near the door, his notebook in hand, while Miss Marple, her knitting basket at her feet, took her place at a small table, her demeanour as calm as the village green outside. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of certainty, "we are here to discuss the tragic death of Lawrence Vane, a poet whose words stirred both hearts and tempers. His murder, in the locked attic of his cottage, was no random act but a carefully staged performance meant to baffle us. Yet, like a poorly knitted scarf, it has flaws that reveal the truth." Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, swept the room, noting Clara's trembling hands, Holt's tight smile, Giles's rigid posture, and Thomas's averted gaze. She folded her hands, her knitting untouched for now. "Let us begin with the scene. An attic, a dagger, a broken wineglass, a half-burned letter, and a window locked from within, yet scratched on the sill. Each clue tells a story, and together they point to the killer." She paused, letting the silence settle. "Miss Beaumont, you told us you brought wine to celebrate Vane's work, sharing a glass before a quarrel at 9. Yet the postmistress saw you near the cottage past 10, and the glass's shards suggest a drop, not a struggle. Your grief, though vivid, seems a performance, and I wondered if you hid a deeper motive." Clara's eyes widened, her lace handkerchief pressed to her lips. "I loved Lawrence," she cried, her voice trembling. "I'd never harm him. Yes, I was there later. I returned to apologize, but he was alive when I left." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Perhaps, let us turn to Mr. Holt, whose ambition outstripped his profits. You visited Vane to press for a new contract, one he refused, laughing at your commercial dreams. The grocer spoke of your purchase of an ornate dagger, a curious gift for a client. Your financial strain was clear, Mr. Holt, but your polished manner suggests a man who avoids violence, not one who wields it." Holt's cufflinks glinted as he shifted, his smile strained. "I wanted Vane alive, Miss Marple. He was my investment. The dagger was a gift, nothing more. I left him scribbling, not bleeding." Miss Marple's gaze moved to Thomas. "Mr. Vane, your brother's success was a shadow over your life. your debts a burden he refused to ease. You were seen near the cottage at 10, your alibi at the pub. Weakened by the barmaid's uncertainty, you knew the cottage's secrets, its latches and quirks, from childhood. Yet your resignation, your weariness, speaks of a man defeated, not driven to murder. Thomas's hands clenched, his eyes on the floor. I wanted his money, not his life, he muttered. I never went inside that night. The door was locked. Miss Marple's eyes settled on Rupert Giles, whose sneer had faded, replaced by a pallor that betrayed his nerves. Mr. Giles, your feud with Vane was public, your pride wounded by his satire. His latest poem, unpublished, accused you of taking bribes for reviews, a charge that would ruin your reputation. You admitted to confronting him in the attic, demanding he retract it. He refused, saying the truth would out. That truth, I believe, was in a letter he wrote, meant for a literary journal, exposing your dealings. Giles's spectacles glinted as he leaned forward, his voice sharp. Lies. Vane's poem was slander, nothing more. I left him alive, Miss Marple. You've no proof otherwise. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her words were steel. Proof is in the attic, Mr. Giles. The letter, half-burned, bore Vane's words. Truth must out, though daggers guard its gate. You saw it during your confrontation, realized its threat, and returned later, using a thin tool to lift the window's latch, a trick you learned, perhaps, from studying the cottage during your visits. The dagger, a gift from Mr. Holt to Vane, was at hand, its ornate handle a fitting irony for a critic felled by poetry. You stabbed him, burned the letter to hide your secret, but in your haste left a fragment behind. The wineglass dropped in panic, and the bottle, taken to obscure your presence, complete the scene. Giles's face drained of colour, his hands shaking as he gripped the chair. This is preposterous, he stammered. I'm no murderer. Critic stepped forward, his voice firm. We've more, Mr. Giles. The journal editor in London received a copy of Vane's letter, sent before your visit. It names you, your payments from rival publishers. We found a wire in your rooms, matching the window scratch, and traces of wax from Vane's candle on your coat. He signalled to a constable, Rupert Giles, you're under arrest. Giles collapsed. Back, his defiance crumbling. I couldn't let him ruin me, he whispered, his voice breaking. My reputation, it was all I had. As the constable led him away, the room exhaled, Clara's sobs mingling with Holt's stunned silence and Thomas's grim nod. Miss Marple gathered her basket, her work done. Outside, the village lay quiet, the stars pricking the sky. Back in her cottage, she settled into her armchair, the fire's glow casting shadows across the room. Her knitting resumed, the needles click a steady rhythm as she reflected on the case. Vane's poetry, sharp as a dagger, had cut too deep, and Giles, driven by fear, had silenced him. The truth, as Vane had written, had indeed come out through the cracks of a locked window and the ashes of a burned letter. St. Mary Mead's peace was restored, and Miss Marple, with a final stitch, set her needles aside, the poem of murder complete.